Fran Bow is the incredibly dark, twisted, and tragic tale of a young girl and her fractured mind. But despite releasing over 6 years ago, the game still remains a mystery to many. Hello viewers, my name is Tericho, and today I'm going to tackle the mind-bending roller coaster that is Fran Bow. I'm going to explain the story, offering several interpretations of the major plot points, so massive spoilers for the game ahead. However, this video will serve as the basis for several theories and themes that I will explore in later videos, so be sure to like this video and let me know down in the comments below if you want to see more Fran Bow content after this one. I also want to warn viewers of a sensitive nature that the themes of this game can get very dark, so you have been warned. So without further ado, welcome to Tericho Explains Fran Bow. You play as Fran Bow Dagenhart, a 10-year-old girl who lived with her parents and her best friend and pet cat, Mr. Midnight. Fran is very curious about the world, as many children of her age are, and she has a wild imagination, being described as highly creative by Aunt Grace. Despite the many tragic events that unfold in the story of Fran Bow, Fran retains a cheeky and positive outlook on life, and she shows a fierce determination, especially for a girl so young. Despite this, however, Fran Bow is also deeply troubled, and as we will discuss later, her mind is incredibly fractured, which is the basis for many of the plot points in this game. Fran Bow is a tale about loss, mental health, grief, and acceptance. Inspired in part by one of the creator's own life experiences, Fran Bow has themes of childhood trauma, adults and corruption, escapism, mental fragility, and coping mechanisms. The game also contrasts the dark and brutal nature of real life with the colourful and wonderful mythical lands that we will discuss in the plot. Overall, the story is one of tragedy, but also resilience. The game is constantly contrasting things, dark and light, good and bad, real and imaginary. And just like the plot, the game leaves conflicting messages in the player's mind. In a way, the game is more of a question than a story, but I will do my best to explain exactly what we see in the game, but also what it could mean. Fran's tale begins with the depiction of a happy home. Fran's parents gift her a pet cat, which she names Mr. Midnight due to his black coat, calling him her best and only friend. Fran describes how sometimes her parents go out, leaving Aunt Grace in charge, which Fran doesn't mind because Aunt Grace looks after her well. Everything here seems perfect, however, that's all about to change. On one Monday night, Fran feels a sinister presence in her home, which manifests as a strange creature outside of her window. After hearing her mother scream, Fran rushes to her parents' bedroom and is horrified to see her parents dead, mutilated, and sliced into pieces on the floor in front of her. Fran is shown to be bleeding from the eyes, which could be a representation of her seeing blood, but it also could be symbolic of her seeing red, which is a point we'll revisit later. Fran flees from the house, which is now depicted as being overflowing with blood, symbolizing how she now associates the house with blood and death. She collapses in the nearby woods, and after some time, she is picked up by an unknown figure wearing a dark cloak. Fran wakes up in the doctor's office of an asylum, and is being questioned by Dr. Dean. Dean is trying to aid Fran's recovery of this traumatic event, but it's clear that witnessing her parents' death like this has taken a huge toll on Fran's mental health. Whatever treatments Dean has tried up until this point have not worked, leading Dean to try medicating Fran. Those medications have also not worked, and Dean decides to try a new medicine, Duotine. Fran takes the Duotine, but the medicine makes her see the room filled with blood, raining decapitated heads with a shadowy figure lurking behind it. This shadowy figure, we will learn later, is called a Kamala. Fran collapses and Dean warns the nurse to never let Fran take that medicine again. While passed out, Fran once again sees the sinister creature that visited her house on the night of her parents' death. The creature warns her that if she leaves the House of Madness, that he will hunt her down and bring her back to insanity. Mr. Midnight also shows up in this dream and explains that the medicine will help her escape and that he'll be waiting for her in the forest outside of the asylum. This is where you can begin to interpret the story in at least 2 different ways. The sinister creature that visits Fran looks demonic, with goat horns and a skeleton head that is a very common way that demons are depicted. However, you could also interpret this as Fran's inner demon, with the implication that if Fran leaves the asylum and stops her treatment, her madness will take over. But it's also possible that the demon is a real supernatural horror and was the cause of Fran's parents' death. These 2 opposing interpretations will offer different explanations for many of the major plot points of the game, and will lead into my own personal 3rd interpretation that we will discuss later. Fran wakes up in the asylum and learns that she was asleep for days due to the Duotine. We as the player learn that Dr. Dean believes Fran is suffering from psychosis, but the medications have been cancelled due to side effects. Fran decides to take Mr. Midnight's advice and escape the asylum. Along the way, she meets several other children who are also suffering from a range of mental disorders. Phil appears to have also talked to the demonic creature that haunts Fran, although it's not clear if this is true or if this is Fran imagining that the demon visits him as a way for Fran's mind to explain Phil's condition, which is described as paranoid behaviour. After causing mischief and distracting the nurse, Fran searches her desk, finds a locked box and a gun, which she leaves behind. Fran cracks the code on the box and she finds her duotine pills inside. After taking the duotine once more, Fran sees an alternative version of the asylum. Rooms that were once clean become covered in blood and gore. The shadowy Kamalas return, and staff members appear to be dead in this world. Many of the messages written in blood seem to hint at some form of guilt that Fran is experiencing, asking who did it. And Fran sees a vision of Aunt Grace arguing with Dr. Dean, who urges her to keep something a secret from Fran. This is foreshadowing of some later plot points, but it's also another scene that lays the seeds of multiple interpretations. Fran is witnessing this scene as if it were happening now, but how could Fran see this happen, especially when she's not in this room? This implies that it could be a memory. It's possible that Fran was in the room while this conversation happened, perhaps unconscious, due to the medications that she was taking. So either this memory is buried in her subconscious, or the duotine is allowing her to see something that she shouldn't be able to. From here on out, I'm going to call these two interpretations the mind and the supernatural. Fran continues to explore the asylum, realizing she needs to get out the yellow door to escape. Fran encounters several staff members, including an incredibly creepy guard, who uses his position of power in very abusive ways. The alternative version of this room contains a pig strung up with its head on a plate. This represents how the man is a pig, but there is a far darker implication here, when Fran describes the pig as being naked and starts asking questions about the pig's body parts. This is one of several examples of the game highlighting how people in positions of power can let those below them down. The implication is further reinforced by how angrily Fran throws coffee on the guard, but this allows her to take his key for Dr. Dane's office. While inside, Phil locks Fran in, prophesizing that Fran will die when the moon arrives. Fran is forced to take the duotine once again, and she sees a version of herself dead on the bed. This has a number of implications and foreshadowing, but it could also represent how Fran feels metaphorically dead in this place, possibly due to her being sedated often. Luckily, a strange skeletal hand opens the air vent, allowing her to escape. While crawling through the vents, Fran falls into the basement. She finds a box of duotine, although this time there appears to be two different types, the red pills that Fran takes and another version that's yellow. It's not yet clear what the difference is, but while opening the door to the basement, Fran has yet another vision of the demon, which taunts her once again, this time threatening to mark Mr. Midnight for death if she doesn't comply. Mr. Midnight tells Fran to meet him at the end of the maze, and Fran discovers a number of patients who have undergone brain surgery, and using the duotine, she reveals the name Itward, which she remarks she doesn't know who that is. Fran finds herself in the reception, with a tiny photo that looks very familiar if you've played another game by Kill Monday. Fran needs to get past the nurse, but she cannot do so without taking the duotine. This is yet another ambiguous plot point. If you follow the supernatural plot, taking the duotine causes the nurse to disappear, allowing Fran to place the keys on the rack unseen. That causes the nurse to leave. But it's also possible that Fran just managed to sneak past the nurse and that taking duotine just changed her perception of what really happened. Fran finally escapes the asylum, but as she does so, the creepy guard from earlier spots her, and very angrily yells at her, saying he's going to make her pay. But before he can do anything, the demon shows up yet again, kills him and grabs Fran, attempting to drag her back into the asylum. Something startles him, however, and he retreats. It turns out that a mechanical cat saved Fran. This is where the story diverges yet again. If we take the supernatural interpretation, we can just assume that what we saw is exactly what happened. But the mind interpretation is much darker. It's possible that the thing grabbing Fran wasn't the demon at all, it was the guard grabbing Fran, and Fran's mind is protecting her by imagining that it's a demon instead of a more brutal reality that she's being attacked by an abusive guard. Like much of what's to come, it's possible that Fran's wild imagination is taking over during the most painful experiences as a form of coping mechanism. This is one of several examples of the game highlighting how people in positions of power can let those below them down. This is further reinforced by the next cutscene. The scene describes creatures of the night which will hunt Fran and laugh. With what we know about the guard and Fran's imagination being a possible coping mechanism, we can infer a much, much darker message from this image, especially with the shadows grabbing at Fran and the shadow's mouth looking like a zipper. But like most things in this game, the shadows could be more literal, and we will explain that later. Fran now finds herself in the woods, but Mr. Midnight is nowhere to be found. She meets a giant ant named Antonio, who explains his beetle pig has eaten a cat. In an attempt to free Mr. Midnight, Fran encounters a number of strange creatures, including luciferns that appear as heads with golden hair caught on a tree, and living pine cones inside a small house. This is yet another hint that everything might not be as it seems. Back in the asylum, one of the TV channels was playing a documentary that showed an ant and a pine cone. Now Fran is seeing fantastical versions of ants and pine cones. Perhaps this is another hint that this is all in her head. After chopping up the beetle pig, Fran learns that Antonio was mistaken and it was a rat that was eaten, not a cat. The rat explains that someone took Mr. Midnight and they disappeared down a well. Fran crafts a door for the well which acts as a portal and she enters. Inside the well is a house. Fran searches it and finds Mr. Midnight locked in a cage in the attic. The key is held by conjoined mysterious twins known as Mia and Clara. The twins explain that they weren't always this way. They were cursed and they want Fran to perform a ritual on them which they will gather the ingredients for. They also explain that Fran has to do what they say since they are older and they won't let her talk to Mr. Midnight until she does what they say. The toad tells Fran not to trust the sisters, and so Fran alters the ritual with a spell she finds in a bottle in the well. Fran tricks the sisters and performs her spell instead, causing the twins to die, leaving the key to Mr. Midnight's cage behind. Fran learns from a note that the twins were cursed by someone with the name Itward, and that they had vowed to get revenge. It's also made obvious that the twins were patients of the asylum too, except they took the yellow duotine, not the red duotine that Fran takes. This whole area hides yet another dual meaning, just like the rest of the game. The well has two versions, depending on whether Fran takes the duotine or not. In one version, we can see the well as an actual well and not as a house. There are a number of corpses in the well, including one wrapped up in a blue cloth. The mind interpretation could mean that this is the true version of the well, and Fran yet again imagines a nicer version to protect her fragile mind. That, or the duotine, is causing her to hallucinate the other version. It's far more likely that the true version of the well is the well and not the house, meaning the real well has corpses in it, which has very dark implications that we will revisit later. Fran rescues Mr. Midnight, and the two escape on the back of the toad. While crossing a bridge, Fran falls and gets knocked out. When she wakes up, Fran is in a different place, and has been turned into a tree with no arms nor legs. Here all the citizens are either plants or insects, and Fran learns that this is the kingdom of Ithaer. Fran has a conversation with the king, and she believes that she must be dead. But the king explains that Dr. Palontras can restore her arms and legs, and the great wizard can restore her body before opening the door to her home. Once again, this entire chapter has at least two possible interpretations. It is indeed possible that the kingdom of Ithaer is a real place. After all, it's a very wild thing for a child to imagine, even one as creative as Fran. That being said, the chapter name is very intriguing. It's named Vegetative State. That's a very cheeky nod to what could be going on here. After trying to climb out of the well, Fran may have fallen, leaving her in a coma. After all, we see her attempt to climb out once, but fall. And with Fran being on heavy doses of medication, hungry and cold in the bottom of a well, it's not out of the realms of possibility that a hard fall could do some real damage to her. It's entirely possible that this entire segment of the game took place in the asylum, with Fran's lack of arms and legs and body made out of wood being a metaphorical representation of her not being able to move her real body. We have another hint with the king of Ithaer too. In order to allow Fran to speak the language of Ithaer, the king plucks a fruit out of Fran's head. This could be a subtle nod to Dr. Dean, who wants to pluck thoughts and feelings out of Fran's head in a similar way. In fact, to give Fran back her arms and legs, Palontras puts Fran in a strange pink pool, which could represent the sensation of the doctors bathing Fran while she's in her own vegetative state. Through Leon's journal that the toad gave to Fran, and while speaking to the citizens of Ithaer, Fran learns about the 5 realities of essential existence, or free. The third reality being our world, Ithaer being another, and Remor the demon who torments Fran coming from the 5th reality. Fran also learns about the Kamalas, the shadowy beings she had encountered in the asylum and beyond. She learns that they feed off the fear and uncontrolled illness of the human mind, but by purifying them with water, they turn into Volokas, which are peaceful beings. Yet again, it's not clear if the Kamalas are real creatures, or if they are just ways for Fran to explain the mental illnesses of the people she meets in the asylum. Fran learns that the Great Wizard lives inside the mountain Cotrem, but only during the winter, which seems like an age away. However, Fran learns that time in Ithaer doesn't work like time in our reality. With the help of Cogsmith, she gains access to the town's clock that can change seasons at will. Fran meets with the Great Wizard, who explains that he hid the stones in order to stop the gateway between realities from being opened. Fran completes a number of tasks to return his memory, and the wizard returns Fran to her human body. Before Fran can leave Ithaer, she has a vision of herself killing Mr. Midnight, with the vision calling him a traitor. While by itself, this doesn't seem like anything out of the ordinary for this game, this will become a theme that we'll explore in later videos, as it especially ties in with Little Miss Fortune. The Great Wizard opens the door between realities, and Fran leaves Ithaer behind. The next chapter is called My Imaginary Friend, which is yet another hint towards this game being more than meets the eye. Fran finds her bottle of duotine attached to a string, which turns out to be a trap. After freeing herself, Fran meets a skeleton in a suit and top hat. The man introduces himself as Itward, and claims to be Fran's childhood friend. This is already a little bit strange, as Fran had mentioned earlier that she didn't know who Itward was. Itward claims that the twins falsely blamed him for cursing them, and that he's been coming to Fran at night to read her stories since she was a baby. He further explains that she imagined him, but he's not imaginary, just a part of Fran's reality. Itward may have been in part inspired by Rick Mayall's character in the 1991 movie Drop Dead Fred. In that movie, the main character Elizabeth encounters a particularly rough patch in her adult life, which brings back her imaginary friend, Drop Dead Fred. At first, Elizabeth doesn't recognize him, and she refused to believe that he was real. The entire movie makes you question whether Drop Dead Fred is real or imaginary, with equal evidence for both, since Elizabeth, just like Fran, is incredibly stressed and has unresolved childhood traumas. But the ending of the movie implies that he is real. When Elizabeth finally resolves her issues and doesn't need Fred anymore, another child is seen talking to an imaginary friend named Fred too. Although it's entirely possible that Elizabeth imagined that as well, leaving the ending of the movie entirely ambiguous. The parallel here with Fran Bow is obvious. We the player can't be entirely sure whether Itward is real or just yet another figment of Fran's incredibly vivid imagination. Either way, Itward promises to take Fran home in his flying machine. While aboard, Fran views a play that shows Itward trying to help the twins Clara and Mia. Fran also learns about the Ultra Reality from Itward. Itward claims that the Ultra Reality lays beyond our reality, and that humans cannot see it. However, it's implied that Fran's duotine allows her to see this Ultra Reality. So yet again, we have to make a choice. Do we believe that the horrors Fran sees are hallucinations caused by her fractured mind and heavy doses of duotine, or do we believe that the duotine is actually opening Fran's eyes to the Ultra Reality? While travelling, the flying machine is attacked by Kamalas. Fran manages to ward them off using water, but it's too late. The machine is about to crash, but Itward promises to always take care of Fran. Fran wakes up in the woods next to a crashed bicycle. One more hint that the flying machine may have been a figment of her imagination. She's close to her home and tries to get inside. The door is locked, and after sending Mr. Midnight inside, Dr. Dane arrives and convinces Fran to go with her since she can't get inside her home anyway. Dane is concerned, and he explains that something strange is going on. He shows Fran some newspaper clippings that claim Fran froze to death in the woods the day after her parents died. The newspaper also describes Fran's parents as being perfectly sliced, with no signs of a struggle. There is also a picture of a pentagram, similar to how Fran cast the spell earlier in the well house. This part of the game is where the supernatural interpretation gets a lot more evidence. The pentagram is already highly suspicious, as pentagrams have often been linked with occultism, witchcraft, and demons. But the idea that Fran's parents were sliced perfectly, causing them to die instantly without any evidence of a struggle, implies that their death was not murdered by another human. We are also told that Aunt Grace was Fran's mother's twin sister, which draws a parallel with the twin sisters Mia and Clara. Dane also explains the difference between the red and yellow duotine pills. He explains that the red pills were a much higher dosage of the main ingredient, ectoplomatin, and that he claims that the levels in the red pills were much too high. He goes on to explain that ectoplomatin creates a door between the subconscious and the conscious minds, which could explain Fran's hallucinations. However, moments after explaining this, Fran sees a vision of a Kamala behind Dr. Dane, and she goes on to explain Dane's past trauma, which she should have no way of knowing. Dane also explains that the twin girls in the asylum had previously talked about Itward, which is further evidence that he's real, since multiple people have now seen him independently. He finally explains that it was Dr. Oswald, the founder of the asylum, who sewed them together in a twisted experiment, to see what effect it would have on their DNA, but in the end, it proved nothing. Fran and Dean dig up Fran's parents' grave, which also contains a grave for Fran. They both wanted to see if Fran was buried there, but when they open up the final coffin, it is instead the skeleton of a cat. Just as they are both about to leave, Remor appears again and steals Dr. Dean. He then puts Fran in a cage, which he calls the House of Madness, implying the asylum. Once again, it's entirely possible that this all happened as we saw it, but it's also possible that Remor actually represented someone else from the asylum. By this point, Dr. Dean was highly suspicious of something going on in the asylum and was out looking for evidence. It's possible that someone from the asylum came looking for him, especially since Dean had a crowbar on the front seat of his car, which he could have been using for self-defense. Fran wakes up once again. This time she's in her room, but she's chained to her bed. Aunt Grace is here but acting in a very strange and cold way towards Fran. Fran manages to shift into an alternate reality, and sees a different version of herself who gives her a key to unlock her shackles. This is the strangest occurrence of ambiguous plot points yet. The chains that bind Fran should be impossible for her to unlock, massively hinting that she actually did cross realities to get the key. However, the room she is in is actually part of the asylum and not her house, hinting that she's actually in the asylum and just doesn't realise it. Once Fran is free, she sees a picture of her and her friend, Alice, in the closet. This is absolutely dripping with clues and inconsistencies. First of all, Fran has several times claimed that Mr. Midnight is her only friend, and now she claims to have a very close human friend. Alice is also a very clear reference to Alice in Wonderland, which the story of Fran Bow shares a number of similarities with. Perhaps this is where Fran got her wild imagination from. Perhaps Alice in Wonderland is Fran's inspiration for Ithaer. We also learn here that Fran is regularly tied up as she poses a danger to herself and others. We see a straitjacket in her wardrobe, and looking at the back of Fran's dress, we can see straitjacket straps as well. This further implies that what Fran is narrating is unreliable, and also feeds into the idea that the 5 realms of reality spell out free, implying that Fran wants nothing more than to be free of her bonds in the asylum. Fran leaves the room and finds herself in an impossible realm, with fragments of rooms floating in a void. This area could be a reference to Fran's shattered mind or her shattered view of reality. The center room also has 5 doors that correspond to the 5 points on the pentagram. Fran learns from talking skulls that this is Mother Mabuka's realm, and Fran vows to wake her up. After solving several puzzles and assembling a clock, Fran proceeds to wake her up. Mabuka explains that Remor is her son, and that Fran was selected by the 5 realms of essential existence to be the keeper of the key. Like most things in this game, it's not entirely clear if we can trust what our eyes are seeing in this conversation. In order to leave this area, Fran has to trade her tears for a ticket to the doctor, which in itself could be a metaphor for how Fran has to expose her emotions in her sessions with Dr. Dean in order for him to help her. After leaving, Fran once again meets Remor, who not only torments her, but explains he feeds off of her pain and suffering. Remor then goes to show Fran a vision, showing her the one who murdered her parents. There are several interpretations for this scene, and it links back to the guilt that we see far back near the start of the game. It could be the case that Remor possessed Fran, and that he caused her to kill her own parents. It could also be that Remor is just a metaphor for Fran's own demons, and that she killed them due to her own mental illness. However, the fact that her parents were described as being perfectly sliced with no sign of struggle leads me to believe that she didn't do it, as I refuse to believe a 10-year-old girl could overpower 2 grown adults with no struggle. That being said, we don't know if we can trust the newspaper article at all, as everything we've seen this far has been through the eyes of Fran, and we don't know what's real in this world and what is not. The final scenes of the game show Dr. Dean tied up to an electric chair. Fran tries to free him, but is forced to inject him with duotine to wake him up. While she's untying him, Aunt Grace and Dr. Oswald enter the room. Oswald explains that Fran's mother and Aunt Grace were a part of his twin studies, and that they helped him find the key. He also admits to knowing that Remor murdered Fran's parents, admitting that he did a great job. He then reveals that Fran's parents were interfering with his work, with them presumably objecting to his experiments. Aunt Grace explains that Oswald only wants the best for Fran, and that he knew she would be special since she was in the womb. She then explains that Lucia was a traitor who tried to hide Fran from them, and that Oswald wants to experiment on Fran. This yet again has multiple interpretations. If we take it all as truth, it's possible that Oswald is aware of the 5 realities, and that some people have the ability to see things from the other realities, as we know that Leon, Fran and the twins can, and possibly some of the children in the asylum. It could have been he who increased Fran's duotine dosage in an attempt to test her ability to see into the ultra reality. However, it's also possible that he's just deranged and that none of it's real, and he just wants to carry out his morbid experiments on Fran, like he did with the twins. This, yet again, has an incredibly dark interpretation. We earlier saw bodies in the bottom of the well outside of the asylum, and if we assume that Dr. Oswald is the one that is drugging Fran with incredibly high doses of duotine, it seems that Dr. Oswald is abusing his power and using that to perform experiments on young children, sewing two twins together just being one example of his many strange and morbid experiments. We could also look at the newspaper claiming that Fran was dead as part of the conspiracy, with Dr. Oswald once again abusing his power to make people believe that children were dead so that he could do his own experiments on them. And when his experiments failed and children ended up dying, or he killed them, he ended up dumping them down the well. After more conversation, Aunt Grace drops Mr. Midnight into the void, causing Fran to become incredibly angry. She yells that Aunt Grace helped to kill her parents and that she hates her, before leaping on top of her and beginning to strangle her. The voice of Remor can be heard in the background while Aunt Grace calls desperately for help. Once again, we have to make a choice in our beliefs. We can choose to believe that Fran is hallucinating, that her fractured mind is causing her to attack Aunt Grace, and it's possible that Aunt Grace is entirely innocent. This elaborate plot point just another figment of Fran's twisted imagination. Or we can also view this scene as Fran giving in to Remor. She's finally giving in to the negative emotions that Remor feeds on. In return, he's giving Fran the power to tackle a grown adult like this, which may or may not be how Remor killed Fran's parents, possessing Fran and giving her the strength to do so. Before Fran can harm Grace any further, Oswald shoots her with the gun we saw earlier in the game. Aunt Grace remarks that Fran is insane, once again implying that all of this has been in Fran's head, although she doesn't seem to be too shocked by the fact that Fran is bleeding to death on the floor. Oswald explains that he wants to do the experiment while she's still warm, and it's implied that he wants to extract her brain, which makes sense since we saw multiple patients in the basement who had undergone drastic brain surgeries, leaving them all in vegetative states. We can assume that Oswald was trying to extract their brains, but was unsuccessful. Before Oswald can take Fran to surgery, Itward bursts onto the scene, casting Oswald and Grace away. He explains he's here to rescue Fran. Interestingly enough, Dean can see him. One final time, we have to make a choice. We can either believe that Fran is hallucinating it all yet again, and is just imagining that Dean can see Itward, perhaps her desperate need to prove that she wasn't hallucinating all along, as her brain tricks her one final time. Or we can believe that by injecting Dean with such high levels of duotine, he's now able to see into the ultra reality, and therefore can see Itward and Palontras, who arrives to take Fran. Palontras casts a spell on Fran, reviving her, but Dean drops the duotine and begins to bleed from the eyes. Itward tells Fran that he's under the power of Mabuka now, which has huge implications for Fran's story at the beginning, but once again is ambiguous. Palontras explains that will make Dean have no memory of this, and the three fly off back into Ithaer. The ending, just like the rest of the game, has so many interpretations. If we believe that Ithaer is real, the ending is a happy one for Fran, who is reunited with Mr. Midnight, her friends old and new, and can live out her days in the mythical land of Ithaer, where there is no pain nor suffering. However, if we believe that Fran was in Ithaer while she was in a vegetative state, then that means she is once again in a coma, or possibly that she's dying on the operating table while Oswald extracts her brain, and this is just her brain protecting her in her final moments. However, at the start of the video, I promised to offer a third interpretation. That interpretation is that both of these endings are true. Just like in Drop Dead Fred, the game gives fairly equal weighting to both interpretations. Both sides have a lot of evidence. Each location in the game has similarities to the asylum. Fran's mind is certainly fractured, even if you believe Ithaer is real. We know Fran has lied or is confused several times, and we know her imagination is wild, easily able to concoct these mythical worlds. But then there are inconsistencies that don't make sense if the 5 realities aren't real. For example, how did the twins also see Itward, and how could Fran know about Dr. Dane's childhood trauma? No, my own personal interpretation is that in order to see the other realities, your mind needs to be disconnected from our reality. Fran can only see the ultra reality when she takes the duotine, which we know contains too much ectoplomatin. What if the only reason they allow her to see the ultra reality is because they fracture her mind? The twins are able to see Itward, and they are extremely mentally ill, especially after being sewn together in a morbid experiment. Deanna manages to see Itward after being injected with pure duotine, but also after he's strapped into an electric chair. It's possible that Dr. Oswald was trying to erase his mind because he knew too much, and that this is what allowed him to see into the ultra reality. We could even go one step further and assume that the only reason Fran can get back to Ithaer is because her body lays dying. Her being in a state of near death is what allows her to cross into another reality once more. So that's my interpretation. Fran's mental illness, her biggest weakness, becomes her biggest strength. Losing her parents, being trapped in an asylum full of horrors and abuse, fractures Fran's mind, but also allows her to escape into a different reality. As we will see in later games, the conspiracy that Dane and Fran begin to uncover may have been true all along, with Oswald's greatest work being an attempt to open a door into other realities using the broken minds of children. No matter which version of the story you choose to believe, Fran Bow is an incredibly emotional and thought-provoking tale, one that stays with you for a long time after you finish the game. I have more to add to this story and more theories. I have other videos planned for the series, so be sure to let me know by liking the video and commenting down below if you want to see more. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.